Welcome, Amy, and hello, fellow marketeers, brand builders, data people, and insights folks. Today, we're talking to Amy, and what Amy did wonderful is she put data analytics at the head of a massive organization. So Amy's head of analytics and modeling and insights of the Bank of America. As you can imagine, an organization that has a huge amount of data. It's a massive organization with a turnover of 105 billion euro. And there she managed to build a wonderful data insights organization and put data at the center of decision making. So welcome, Amy, and thanks for being here.
Thanks, Martin. It's great to be here.
Super. To start with, when I met you, you were head of analytics of a creative organization, which at that time you were super into and you were very good at. And it seems somehow to ultimate clash that now you're at a bank. How did that role influence the way you see data and insights today?
It's funny, sitting in a creative role, right? Thinking about how do you help creative people understand how to use data was a fascinating challenge because traditionally people suspect that's a group that wants actually no data. That's not true. They actually really did want data. But to think about what I learned so much there was how do you storytell? How do you get people interested in data and how do you make it matter? To then transition into a bank where data is everything, right? There is a ton of data, as you said, right? Huge company, lots of data, lots of tools. And yet still you're in a place where you have to explain to people and the majority of people don't spend their time with data. And how do you make people comfortable with it? And so it's interesting. The job is different, but it's the same in a lot of ways, actually. It's the same goal of getting people to connect with information in a way that makes them make better decisions.
How interesting. So basically you're suggesting that your experience with storytelling helped you in this role. Did I interpret it correctly or am I going a bit too far?
Yeah, I think so. I think people like to share facts and data and things like that. And I think everyone says they want data. No one wants data. Like people want knowledge. And I think storytelling is that piece that transfers you from like, here's some data to here's some knowledge and an insight and something you can do. And I think my background made me uniquely qualified to be able to take on a task like this and build a team like I have.
That's so interesting. We actually recorded a separate session with Dr. Sarah Stein, and she did a lot of research on how to influence people and how people work. And she'd actually said that, according to her research, data only plays a minor role or a totally over-exaggerated role in convincing people. So this is, let's say, people are much more convinced on the emotional side than by data. And having said that, it must be that at the Bank of America, where there are so many data-driven people, and I say currently your role, but it's just not similar to the data bank, but at all data-driven organizations, data must still be more important than in the creative agency.
For sure. There's just more data, right, to start. So being inside a company, there's a ton of data. There's a lot of access to information. But I also think, right, it is a company that is grounded in using, it's an industry that's grounded in using math to make decisions, right? You think of market, that's math-based things. All of the things that are in finance, rates, those are math-based decisions. So, it is a place where culturally that's an easier fit than it is to go into sitting inside the middle of a creative department and saying, hey guys, math is the way we do business.
Well, that's very true. And in a large place like that, can you have too much data?
You can try to use too much data. You can't have too much data. I don't think that's a thing. But I think people try to use every last scrap they can find. And some data is useless, right? Or it's very fit for purpose for a very specific thing, but you don't want to use it all of the time. And I think there's a tendency to be able to say like, but what about that pile over there? Can you bring that data in? And you're like, I could, it wouldn't add any value. And a big part of building a team is figuring out which data is important when and how do you bring it together in the right way. But there's for sure an over-reliance. There can be an over-reliance on data. Because to your point of and why I came up through creative agencies, you have to have that gut and the emotion side as well. You have to balance those two things to think about how people make decisions.
You mentioned it earlier in an earlier conversation we had, and I found that so interesting. And just between the lines, you mentioned it here. So I could, but how do I use that? How do you want to use the data? So this actually means that you already choose the data streams that you think are relevant by pushing back.
I think when we were talking last time, people always ask answers. They're like, how many of this? What day is that? Like, they think they know the thing they want. They're calling on a specific piece of data. And most often, if you pause and you're like, why do you want to know that? Like, what are you actually trying to solve? And what would you do if you knew the answer? You're like, that's not the data you want at all, actually. You want something totally different. But getting to the core of what is driving curiosity, what is driving the question, that I think makes for a much better conversation, and it helps you figure out the right data to use. Otherwise, you end up just, going and retrieving the answer someone asked for to a very, very specific question that most likely is not going to solve a problem.
That's so fascinating. And I assume that you've worked so long with data, you would know better which data would help solve the problem.
I definitely, exposure helps, and knowing, and I think the nuance of which variables change frequently and which ones don't, what's fast moving, what's slow moving, what is correlated to something, what is not correlated to something, and having that context to be able to say, oh, that's a slow moving metric with no correlation. In this question, you wouldn't want to look at that, right? But in another case, it would be a very good thing for me to do if I'm looking at long-term modeling or valuation and things like that. So I do think having the exposure and the experience to be able to understand kind of how metrics move is really powerful in that conversation.
And does it take long for you to understand how metrics move? Did you have, let's say, when you came into the Bank of America, did you already have this innate feeling of the patterns of how the metrics moved? Or are there some very specific patterns that just takes time to learn, that you first have to like work and see the data for a while?
I think both. There's, right, categorically, I was not new to finance, so right, that categorically, I had some idea of how things were moving. And right, if you're looking at things like favorability and likability consideration, those move in a pretty consistent way across industries. The timelines change, but versus some business metrics, there were some specific things here that I needed to learn when I came in, and understanding of kind of how data is structured and why it's structured that way and what it really means. I think that's the important part when you get into an organization. Is kind of, and it's any company, it's every company. Because I came from working across tons of clients. It's like spaghetti. You got to kind of be like, where did this one come from? What is the root source of that data, and what does it actually mean? I think that's the challenge in starting.
Now that I hear you talk for the second time on the subject, for the readers, we prepared it a bit. What I think is really valuable is your being able to assess or judge the data stream. So one, where does it come from? Because that gives, let's say, more credibility or less credibility to a certain data stream, and how important is it? Two, how important is a data stream for a certain decision? Because then it places your role all of a sudden much more valuable, because you can actually judge the data streams.
I think you can choose also the right metric for the right thing, right? If you're trying to create likability, sales isn't the thing you would go look at. You would want to understand some of the emotions and attachment that people have to a brand. You wouldn't start at the bottom and say, how many units of a thing did I sell? And so I think there is what is the quality of the stream? What is the use of that stream and the source of it? But there is also what is the thing I'm trying to do with this data, and how do I then choose the right thing to evaluate it or to understand both its input and its output?
And you just mentioned there that is, for instance, likability. That suggests that you would have some outside data source, or somebody gathering this data, or some outside custom-made research. Am I correct, or did I interpret that wrongly?
It's really important to have a combination of internal and external data, right? No company should be living in their own little vacuum of their own data, right? It is as though you would pretend like your world is everything to your clients. It's not. They do a lot of other things, and understanding how you fit in that broader context is really important. So that balance of internal and external is, I think, really critical.
But then you need to integrate it.
Yeah, and understand how they're related and how do they move together, for sure.
So
which one drives the other, so you kind of break them apart.
We'll dive into that a little bit later on a bit more. And so you already mentioned it in between the lines a little bit, but let's say, how did you build this function? Because you have all these different data streams and you have all these different things to measure. I mean, where did you start with?
I think I wanted more than one capability, right? There are so many people say data and they're like, oh, that's one job. And it's not, right? There is data for reporting, there's data for analysis, there is modeling and forecasting, there is research. And I think bringing those together is really important when you think about, particularly if you think about how do you get to things like research balanced with analytics, right? I want to know what someone says they're going to do. I also want to know what they actually do, and the tension between those two things, right? If you asked me in a survey, I would tell you that I exercise 5 times a week or more. If you look at actual data, that is not true. Understanding like that tension between those, which, right, you can read that tension is, I would feel guilty about that. I have some underlying thing, right? That's a great insight to understand that I say I do one thing and I actually do another. And I think pairing those kinds of things and being able to balance them is incredible. I also think right? Looking at using something like reporting to say, what is the state of the world today? And modeling to tell me, what does it look like the state of the world will be tomorrow on this topic? Also really important. And so when I thought about what is the best version of a team, you have to have all that capability together to really get the power of it. Any one of them is incredibly powerful. All of them together kind of pushing against each other and offering that tension, I think is really valuable because that's where you're finding insight. It's not just in one piece of information.
And with what do you start? Because your insights and your data that scans such a wide spectrum from global trends to how consumers think and feel.
I think you could start at any one of them, honestly. I think you have to start at a place of I understand the consumer. So that could be I understand what they think, and then you go and figure out how are you going to add on what do they do, right? And how do you acquire data to do that? Either you own it in your company or you go and buy that data, you buy aggregator data or something that would help you understand actual movement. But you could go the other way. I think more often than not, most people start with I have some data about my own customers or my own prospects, and they start there and then they keep adding. And then they say, I might add some research questions on. I might add a few more new things. So I think that's more common. I think where people start with quantitative work and then add qualitative, but it goes both ways, I think.
So basically what you're suggesting is in many cases that there's already some data there. And that is where people start. And then they base their organization on that. They start slowly building up. But then you still need to integrate the data.
Yeah, it's funny. I have worked across clients big and small. And everyone has some kind of data, even when they don't realize it. That's the fascinating part. I worked with a very, very small company at the beginning of my career, and they were like, and we don't have any data. And I was like, well, you have a website, right? Don't you understand what people are looking at it? And they were like, yeah, of course we know what people are looking at. I was like, okay, well, that's data. Let's think about how we look at that over time and how do we break that down by when they came and what types of products and how do you. So I think it's partly understanding what is data and then thinking about how do you structure that. And right, if you can kind of just framework that out and you can draw it on a piece of paper to say, okay, so if I know my website, why did I build the website this way? What's the back end data of that? Right? If I have a CRM tool, I have some data, even if that's just notes, that's still data. I can think about how do I use that information. So I think the data is everywhere, right? People don't realize how much data is available to them in their own company, but also external to their world. I think it's thinking about how to structure it and how to make sense of it is the hard part, right? You might have a log file from your website and you've never even thought about it. And you have to go and say, how
Interesting.
do I decode that? How do I break it down? And you might have a massive data mart of everything anyone's ever spent money on. And you got to think about how do you want to structure that and how do you want to extract information. It's the same problem, big or small, but I think it's figuring out the framework, what you want to do with it is so critical in figuring out how you want to structure it.
So what you want to do with it, that's one. And then how do you want to structure it? That's two. So you mentioned, I think in between the lines or thing, but just to make sure that it becomes very clear. So when you work with such a massive organization, and how do you actually get like data that everybody starts working with data and making decisions on data? And that means that everybody has to start using the same data as well, right?
The same data is so important, I think. I think there's a couple things there. One, there has to be a senior kind of thirst for that, right? There has to be someone that says there's one answer, there is one source of truth, and how do you do that? It's really hard, right? I don't get the right to stand up and be like, I am the source of truth, right? There has to be, in any enterprise, someone that says there is a source of truth and that is it, go there. And that matters, I think, making sure that you've built at the top of your company, at the top of your team, that interest and that importance and that relevance to be able to do it. I also think you have to be able to really quickly show what are the use cases. If you just keep giving people data and they never understand how it made an impact, people's adoption of data usage is going to drop. If you can say, I told you the thing, you did that thing, and you got this result, they're like, oh, I want more of that. I'd like to do it again, right? But if you just keep throwing data at people, eventually they get tired, right? People don't actually just like facts thrown at them all the time. If you translate that into an insight and help them understand how it made them make a change and what impact that had. So I think starting early with those conversations of what you want to accomplish, how can I help you do that with data, I think is really, really important. And I think the last part of it is just acknowledgement that you make decisions beyond data, right? Some are gut, some are market needs, some are right? Like, I have too many widgets on the shelf and I have to sell those now, so I'm going to pivot my strategy. There's more than just the math that's going to make a decision. Math is a factor in something. And in some cases, it's everything. But in a lot of cases, it's one of many factors, and helping people realize that, it's not as black and white as just, well, my data says so it's true, that you can understand the other side of that, I think is really critical.
So Amy, did I just hear you well? Did you say that intuition comes into making decisions in such a data-driven person as you?
It does. The funny part is, I think we were having this conversation before. Yes, I think it does. I also think intuition comes from past data, right? Like
yes,
a prior
it
data collected from a prior experience is what forms your intuition. And so you have that gut feeling of like, oh, I have been down this road 80 times. I know that won't work, right? When you put red on a click spot on a banner and say, go, like, you don't have to test that again and again. That very rarely works as well as green or blue does. Like, that is just known. I don't need to keep relearning that. Intuition is like, that's probably
yes, that's
true
so
here
true.
too, right? Like, you just,
yes,
like,
you're right.
I know that. I feel pretty likely. Some of it is, right? Like, that wouldn't be something anyone would do. And like, you a little bit read your own intuition, and a little bit, like, as a data person, you study people for a living. So intuition, right? It might not be a single piece of data that's making something, but it is having studied people for 30 years through data that makes me really capable of saying, like, I have a feeling how this might go, or like, this probably matters more than we think it does. But I think you've got to really think about people to be able to do that.
And I can already hear it. I mean, that will probably also make you a good storyteller and help sell the data. So that all fits together. So how does your personality or leadership play a role to this? Because I've talked to several people in similar situations, and to say the truth, many of them were struggling into getting such a centralized vision of data and putting data in the organization. And to what extent does your personality play a role in this?
It's funny. It's one of the things, I don't know if I knew how much my personality played a role until I'd used it more, right, over time. And I was having this conversation. I was speaking with a women in finance organization, and we were all kind of talking about how do we do this and the struggles. And they were like, you seem to be rolling forward. And I was like, oh, I think, yeah, there's a couple of things. I'm really stubborn. I don't take no for an answer. I will keep pushing. I really obsess around understanding people and being able to meet them where it matters and connect with them. And I think that aspect of my personality allows me to understand why people are hesitant, how I might want to tell the story differently, and kind of keep pivoting. I don't view everything as black and white. I don't think that I understand everyone. I think being willing to kind of pivot and say, like, tell me more about why you feel that, so that I can pivot my answer back to you. I think that's a really important part. I think probably the last part of my personality is I'm a yes, we can do it, and then figure it out kind of person. I like to try new things. I like to innovate. I like to be a visionary, and I think that helps because you have kind of the will behind that to make things come true. Which some days is probably not my best thing, but I like to think most days it's really helpful.
Well, it does sound that you look very deeply at how data influences people, how storylines influences people, and adjust to that. And that now that you mention it, it makes sense. And I think this is, where market research, it hits a natural barrier. I mean, the more different it becomes, the more radical the situation is, the less you can use data to predict that.
Oh, for sure. What you don't know about a person is their preconceived notions. I could buy a ton of data on you, Martin. I could figure out like enough about you. Where do you live? Where did you study? What kind of products do you buy? Right? All of that is viable, but I still don't know your life experiences that make you react to a piece of information today, right? And that's the unknown, and being able to kind of account for that is really important when you think about things that involve relationships, right? The reliance on a product versus a person, very nuanced, and right, like that changes. So you could be like, I hated that store. They were terrible, but like, gosh, Susie Sherman's great. Like, that might be enough to override any negative experience you had. And so you have to kind of have that full picture, or the knowledge that full picture exists, even if you don't have the full picture.
So this is interesting because you suggested that basically it's not possible to understand the full driving force of a person's decision. Even not if you look at, for instance, a person's values. There, for instance, a lot of research on values and social cultural differences. What Ron Inglehart, the late Dr. Ron Inglehart, started, a hero of mine. But then you still suggest that won't be enough to deeply understand how people behave in certain ways and drive certain decisions.
I think we're getting closer every day, for sure. And I think back to the beginning of the balance of what people think and what they do, and understanding that helps a ton. I think when you're like thinking about multiple sources of data and bringing them together in multiple dimensions, I think that helps a lot. Do I think there's a perfect answer that can perfectly explain a human? I don't. I think there's also like you woke up and your shoulder hurts a little bit, so you're crankier today. And maybe you don't like the
Yes.
product that you liked yesterday.
Yeah.
I can't see that coming. I don't know. I could have said I guessed everything about Amy. I got it all right. I knew exactly what she would do. And she came in and she just didn't feel well. So now everything's different. Like, you don't know. It's a piece of data, but it's a piece of data that I may get a signal for in that moment. And I may have the apparatus to receive that signal in that moment, but I might not.
Interesting. I think you're very right. Sometimes we perhaps have too much of that the world is makeable, that data is makeable, and all decisions and how people react is predictable, which in a sense, to a certain extent, is true, but to a large extent is not true indeed as well. And can you give me an example when we look at the other end of the spectrum? So when data was enough to drive a big business decision?
I think that there's a million examples of that. I think that happens a lot, where you can, and right, some of those are, you're not in that moment decision, right? There are big decisions you can make where you have massive volume of data, you have history of data, you have breadth of data, you have enough things where you're like, okay, great. I can pretty clearly see that's a product that will work, or a product that won't work, or a rate that will work, or a rate that won't work, right? Those kinds of things. I think it's down in the very last moment of a decision. I think that's where you get less control. Like, you can personalize yourself right up to that moment, and then something goes haywire and you can't account for it. Hopefully you can capture data, and you've built kind of a process for that. But I think when you're thinking about, on the very easy side, slower moving decisions, right? Those are easy. When you think about kind of understanding groups of people and what motivates them, I think that's pretty easy. When you think down to like that very last mile, that's the hardest part to predict.
Indeed, I think you're very right in that. I think, and so if, let's say, are there any misconceptions? And then if, let's say, you manage to place data in the center of the role, in the center of the organization, are there any misconceptions that you came across this, or things that, you had to overcome in how people look at that?
I think it's interesting. If you look historically at the analytics industry, most people who ran a team like mine were pure mathematicians. And it's what you want. I have a ton of statisticians, PhDs, they're brilliant, brilliant people. There is an assumption, I think, often that those people don't understand the business, that they're like, no, you're super good at math, but you don't understand my business. And that creates tension, right? There is an assumption of like, sure, you know that, and I know this, and together we can make a decision. I don't think that's true. I think, for the most part, in my experience, even my most senior PhD statisticians understand the business. They take the time to understand it. But I think there's a misconception that that's not true. Right, to your point, people assume that because I'm a data person that I only make decisions with data and that I never use a gut. And I think, right, not true. I, like the rest of the world, I actually use gut decisioning as well. So I think there's that. And there's a hard line, I think, when you live in a world of facts, where your job is to present the facts and in a very non-subjective way, right? You have to be able to say, this is the thing I'm talking about. These are the results. These are the answers. These aren't my opinions. But I think it makes people feel that you can't have an opinion. And so there's you can drive that all the way into strategy. But I think there's this kind of misconception of like, okay, so that's a facts only place. Got it. I'll go pick up a fact there. But it's because it's what we have to do. You have to be neutral. You have to kind of stay in the center to be able to share information in a way that people will respect it.
What you mentioned at the beginning, that just because a person has a mathematics background, that you assume that he doesn't understand the business. This is something that, those misconceptions, apparently you also see at that level. There's a lot of research about bias and how we look at different groups of people with inherent bias, or how we do or don't. But apparently we also have this on roles people have in a company and their background. And, that's just fascinating that a data person would not understand the business as good as a manager.
And I think it works the other way. I think data people assume that the business people don't understand the math of it, right? There's such a myth because some of the things we do are really complex, right? I can build a neural network model. That's not easy. Like most people cannot do that. So there's an assumption that no one will understand it. Like that's not true. People really do understand it. Some of my best partners can break that thing apart and ask great questions. Could they build one? No. Do they understand it and how to use it? For sure. Do I understand their business and how they're going to use it? Also, yes. But I think you have to kind of build enough rapport to discover each other's strengths there and kind of trust each other in that space.
How interesting. And good that you have to be aware of this, that once you're aware of it, you can do something about it and you can address it. One of the things that you mentioned a bit earlier, which I always find incredibly fascinating, and that's what drives me, is the difference what people say and what people do. And what you suggested, that people have a different image. And how do you actually measure that?
It's funny. I've spent a lot of my career trying to find that gap right there, right? In an easy way, I take survey data, and I could use the fitness example, but there's a million of them, right? You take survey data that says, here's how I feel about it. Voting, right? Polls that happen that way. You look at what a poll will say is going to happen and what actually happens, and you line those up to understand where were the differences. Was that a certain demographic? Was that a certain part of the country? Was that, et cetera? You look at that on things like fitness and health. I think it's one of the biggest gaps between what someone says in research and what they say in actual data. But then being able to run those and identify what makes the variance then. Are there certain traits of a person that make that not align? Are there certain things, or are there certain other truths that I need to know? And I think connecting those two data pieces, sometimes that's literally like straight correlation. And then you break it down and say, okay, what are the subgroups? What are the segments? And where do I see that correlation varies? And then some of them are just more kind of observational data pieces where you're like, got it. Okay. If Amy says she exercises, but she doesn't, what does that actually say about her? What is the real truth there? Because you might say, I'm going to give her all Nike hardcore performance athlete stuff because I said I exercise obsessively. When you realize that you're like, I kind of do, but maybe not as much, you're like, okay, maybe down a level in what I'm going to offer her. I might not be offering high performance materials. I might be offering more athleisure, more occasionally used, less supplements, things like that. But I think you have to kind of think it through.
That's so interesting. And you made the reference to political research. And with political research, there's always so much data that you can drive down to, the different socio-demographic segments. Are they underscoring? Are they overscoring? How different messaging works for different groups? And is it better than expected? But this implies that you have a massive, massive amount of data. Political polling is known for that. The stakes are so high that you can actually invest and they do huge amounts of money in polling and surveying, because only a small percentage different drives massive outcomes. But I suppose that
like the more polarizing, the more you need that intersection of data, right? On things like politics, things like religion, things like health, finance, money. Like you need to understand the perception people want to have, where you have a difference in what I'd be willing to say on the street and what is actually true.
Yeah.
The amount of data you need to understand that nuance is really critical. And the variety of types of data you need is really critical in those places, right? When you're thinking about something like which gum am I going to choose? Now I need a ton of data. I need data, by the way. I've done that for a job, and you do need data for that too. But not the same you need as things that you don't want to say the same on. Like I'm pretty comfortable telling you I like spearmint gum on the street, and I would secretly also still buy spearmint gum. There is no need for me to lie about that, right? There's no perception gain by me not telling the truth. In categories where there's a perception gain that someone needs, that's where you have to really think about how do you have that dimensional data to help explain all of it.
So basically, where the decisions don't drive close to your personality and don't drive who you are, that is where you need less data. That's more, if you buy a Cadbury or Milka, Cadbury, I'm not sure if there's a lot of Cadbury in the US, chocolate bar, then it really doesn't matter. But when it comes to more lifestyle orientated data, for instance, the image we have ourselves and how much we sport, then it becomes more interesting. And you need this data.
I think you need to, I've done anything from like the smallest piece of gum as a career all the way up to financial institutions. You need data in all of those things, right? Because if I'm selling Cadbury, I want to know what are the occasions in which I allow myself to treat myself, and what are the types of things I do, and what kind of information on the package helps me decide, like, yeah, I feel comfortable having a candy bar today for snack. Like, you need all of that data. It's just a different, you don't need to find tension in that data. You need to find observation in that data. And it's so incredibly important versus where you kind of move up that spectrum. You need to be able to find tension of like, what is the thing that's true and what is the thing I'm worried about behind it? And there's some of that, right? I'm worried about the calories in a candy bar. I need to know that, but like, that's pretty straightforward. You might have guessed that. So, but I think it's data in all of them, but it's the kind of variety of data and the tension in the data that you need as you go to those more complex decisions. That's really important.
Okay, now, so you have all this data and you put it all into a massive database. But then you're bound to get this spaghetti mess of data, and perhaps some data should be prioritized more than others. And perhaps it should be also more, let's say, what do you prioritize? And what happens when you have conflicting data?
I think that's where, part of what I focus on is how do you use modeling, how to use optimization, how do you build scenarios, right?
Yeah.
If you think about operations research or optimization, you're doing if then thinking, right? If this is true, then what do I do? If this is true, then what do I do? And so being able to think about data that way, how do you look for the strongest signal in your data? So if I want to understand, right, I used to work with a telecom, and one of the things we wanted to understand was how emotion informs their decision. And right, so I'm running a regression analysis to be able to understand the impact of that thing, to be like, this factor, yes, this one, no. So like service, big problem with emotion. Pricing, not really. Like it seems like it would be, but people could move past it quickly. And wait time,
How
less so.
interesting.
And so how do you use that data to kind of understand which thing matters for what you're trying to study, and then prioritize that? And that's the strong, it's all about, you always hear me say it, that's all about what is the strongest signal. And that's how you prioritize. And by the way, that signal might change over time. The strength of the signal might change. And so you have to be constantly watching to say, in that spaghetti, which one's shouting?
And that also suggests that you need to be at least very technical or IT friendly, because all this data needs to be organized and structured. And that means that you have to translate this into IT decisions, into database decisions, into technical decisions. If you dive a little bit deeper into the technical side with AI coming into to the picture, that means personalization will even go further. Does it still merit to work with larger segments? Or now that we're going to more and more personalization, segmentation to a certain extent is becoming less obsolete, or is becoming less relevant or obsolete?
It's going to be an interesting thing to watch. I have always believed in there's an important spectrum between what I would call segments, tribes, and personalization, right? All three can exist. So segment, I may be, right? I am a mom of 2 college-age kids, right? That is a group I belong to, a New York City working mom with kids. That's my segment. I am in a tribe of people who is passionate about giving back to kids in my community. If you go to personalization, I am looking to buy a car for my daughter and a pair of boots for myself, right? Like you could, so yeah, those things all exist and they're all really important to know about me. And so I think, can AI do all of that to say, and yeah, you could use the AI. AI is a tool. I could use AI to do any one of those 3 jobs. It could build that segmentation and say, here's the thing Amy has in common with the group around here. Here is the thing she's really passionate about, and here is the thing that she's going to do today. AI can do all those jobs. It's a tool. And can it do it faster and better and with more data? Yeah, it can. So that's kind of incredible. But I don't say AI replaces the need for segmentation. I think it changes the way we build that dynamically rather than remove the need for it. Because not everything is about the very finite moment of me. It is about the bigger group I belong to, helps me make my decisions as well.
And that group changes, of course, based on the context.
Yeah. Well, it's like brand advertising, right? You're not going to do brand advertising at an individual person level. Not only, you may also do that, but right, some of that is like, this is what we stand for as a brand, and we want to connect with people across segments to do that. And so you have to know those segments to make sure that that brand is going to land well. but you're not going to necessarily use them. You just need to be aware of them, of like, this is the population that I'm looking at. And that doesn't go away. You still have to understand people, but you can't understand, millions of people individually to try to make a brand decision. You try to understand what are the major groups that are sitting under that, and is this going to land well with them, and how do I test that? But then you might get down to the personalization level of like, what is the message I need for this person to make a decision in this moment? But you pair those two things together.
And let's say you must do a lot of modeling then when I listen to you and with the information. So if you have a choice between modeling or experimentation, what would you prefer?
That's such a funny question. Depends on the situation. How's that for an annoying answer?
Yeah.
A funny example. I worked with Sprint years ago, and one of the things, right when they had the robots in their ads,
Yeah.
and what we wanted to know was like, does showing the big robot and the baby robot do better? Do people get more attached to the brand with that? Or right, and we were down to testing, like, is it a family of robots? Is it a single robot? Is it an up close of the robot? Is it a far away of the robot? And like, that's experimentation. I could not begin to model that if I tried. By the way, they like to see like part of the large robot and all of the small robot. Fascinating.
Yeah.
And it makes a big difference, which is even more fascinating. Experimentation is the perfect thing for that, because I can keep putting different versions in front of someone and understanding and testing and learning and doing that. I think modeling on the other side is, right, I can look and say, I see a bunch of signals from Amy. Which of them is she most likely to actually, what is she most propense to do? Which channel is she most propense to do? And modeling, perfect for that. So Amy looks like she's going to buy this product. If we give her this offer right now, modeling, it's incredible. And what a great way to be able to do it and predict the outcomes. Particularly when I want to productionalize that and do that in real time. But it's, I think in that case, I wouldn't do experimentation. You could test it, but it'd be a long thing. I could also do modeling and do it in real time and be able to gain feedback and kind of keep closing that loop versus doing experimentation. Depends a little on your goals and your comfort level.
When you tell it to me in such a clear terms, it makes all the sense in the world. Something else, what would you source in and what would you always use an agency for?
That's a good question. I believe a combination of kind of in-housing and out-housing is important. I think it depends on what you have in-house and on what you go outside for. You want to bring in the thing that is your specialty and is closest to you. So when I look at, a lot of times where I've been doing my outside dollars are where's culture and trends. I have people that analyze them internally, but like that's not data I try to source on my own. I do some of that, but also there are a ton of sources where I can buy that. I think one is it easier and more affordable for me to do that inside and outside or outside? And I think sometimes culture data and certainly political data, landscape data, there's so many incredible sources for that you can just go outside for, that like you can replicate inside, but you don't have to. Versus if I want to know my own customers and kind of how they interact with me and what matters, I might want to do my own thing. I might want that proprietary intelligence and piece there. So I think it depends a little bit. I'm a huge fan in having a 360 view of a person, and you can't do that with your own data. You can get part of a view, but you have to round that out with things from the outside. Right? Otherwise, you assume that the thing you do is the only thing that matters to the person you're selling to, and that's insane. So having that outside perspective to say, what are all the other things is so important. Even when you have a ton of data, adding to it richens the story you're able to tell.
We're nearing the end of our session, and we had so much insights on how you built a data organization and how you made data-driven ways of looking at companies inside larger organizations. And I find it very admirable. So you have another big fan, Amy. If I'm ever in a position that I have so much data and I need somebody to look at it in such a balanced way, I know where to find you.
Thanks, Martin. I really enjoyed the conversation.